At the end of World War II, Britain had a considerable automobile industry that held 80% of the domestic market and around 40% of global exports. With the new Attlee government commanding the heights of British industry and being the largest recipient of Marshall Plan funds, it seemed that Britain was destined to become the biggest car manufacturer in post-war Europe. But things did not turn out quite as we might have hoped. As the post-war years saw decade after decade of decline, and now we live in a world where large-scale British car production is non-existent. How did this happen? The British car industry slowly conglomerated into the vast nationalised industry of British Leyland in 1975, which at the time still had a 35% domestic market share and 15% share of global exports. Deep-rooted inefficiencies in comparison to global competitors were already apparent. In the 1970s, one employee at Toyota would produce 30 units per annum, whereas at British Leyland, one worker produced around 5 to 6 vehicles, meaning Toyota were easily 5 times more efficient in their production and were generally producing better quality cars. Is it any wonder that the British industry lost out over the years? Any attempts to replicate the Japanese production would involve reducing the workforce by introducing multi-skilled workers, something that would always have been opposed by the unions. This inefficiency was exacerbated by the insane demands of some of the more militant unionists. One illuminating example was the period of disputes led by Derek Red Robbo Robinson at the Birmingham Longbridge plant, where in the late 70s the factory suffered 523 walkouts in 30 months, costing the company $200 million in lost production, or $1.2 billion in today's money. Robinson was dismissed in 1979 and had clearly lost the support of even the shop floor. A ballot for a sympathy strike returned 604, with 14,000 against. These incidents were common in the 1970s, and for a supply chain reliant industry like car manufacturing, this can be fatal. In 1975, strikes at the Dunlop tyre factory could halt production at Longbridge, reducing their output and sending negative reverberations throughout the supply chain. Around the same time, the Japanese were perfecting the revolutionary just-in-time manufacturing process. The strikes at the Longbridge plant cost British Leyland around a fifth of their annual revenue at a time when they were already in financial distress and relying on government bailouts. 7 years after it had been nationalised with a £1.5 billion cash injection from Harold Wilson's government, British Leyland slowly began to be privatised. Jaguar was sold in 1982, there was a rebrand to the Rover Group when the truck and bus business was sold to DAF, and then, in 1988, fully privatised when Margaret Thatcher sold Rover to BAE for $150 million. This stake was then sold to BMW for $800 million, but losses persisted, and BMW broke the company up, with the Phoenix Consortium buying the Rover, MG brands and the Longbridge plant for the nominal sum of £10. Ford bought Land Rover, while BMW kept the Mini brand. The MG Rover Group was the last British-owned volume car maker, employing around 6,000 people. It stabilised for a brief period, but could not halt the decline, and with losses of £67 million a year and under 100,000 units produced annually, the company entered administration in 2005. It was bought by the Nanjing Automobile Corporation, and much of the machinery of the Longbridge plant was shipped to China. Lucas Aerospace was another example of an industry attempting to increase efficiency, being hit with unrealistic worker demands. Amid government cuts to military spending, management attempted to streamline the business so they would be more competitive in Europe's defence market. The company's employees' response to these layoffs was the alternative corporate plan. While it contained many innovative ideas that would later become products, it also demanded the company shift away from its military production. At that time, defence contracts accounted for 50% of Lucas Aerospace's revenue and were more profitable than the civilian sector. So I can understand why the board was reluctant to abandon its core market to spend R&D money on helping people with spina bifida. The Lucas plan had been inspired by a meeting with Tony Benn in 1976, a year that also saw the Callaghan government dealing with a financial crisis that would set the tone for Britain's economic future. With inflation running at 25%, the value of the pound collapsing on international markets, and unable to secure loans for more government spending, Chancellor Denis Healey was forced to apply for an IMF loan. An alternative to the loan was presented by Tony Benn, the Alternative Economic Strategy. But this just contained more of the same far-left economic medicine. More nationalisations, worker involvement, and import controls. Benn's plans were rejected in favour of the IMF loan that came with monetarist strings attached, in the form of spending cuts, wage restraint, and general austerity. While Thatcher would take us further down this road, the journey began 3 years before she took office. There is a growing element on the left, particularly by those who are not alive to experience it, to paint a rosy picture of the 1970s, before Thatcher ruined everything. But it is worth remembering that during this era, Britain was maligned as the sick man of Europe for its relative economic stagnation. In 1979, there were 40 major state-owned enterprises, accounting for 10% of GDP, 14% of capital investment, and 9% of employment. These industries were heavily dependent on government financial support. The external financing requirement was $2.3 billion for the 79-80 financial year, contributing to around 20% of public borrowing. British Coal, British Steel, British Rail, and British Airways all operated at a loss, and while monopoly utilities sometimes managed to break even, they were known for poor service. In 1980, some customers had to wait months or even years to have their phone lines connected, with a waiting list of nearly 500,000. Due to abysmal return on investment of around 0 to 2%, BT did not have the money to invest in new infrastructure and was seen as holding back the development of a modern telecoms network. During her time in office, Thatcher reduced the debt-to-GDP ratio from 46.83% to 35.68%, with an average annualized growth rate of 2.1% per annum. Far from ruining the country, Thatcher's reforms had laid the foundations for the period after the recession caused by the pound's rejection from the ERM, where the UK entered a period of 60 consecutive quarters of economic growth, the longest period of consecutive growth in modern UK history, before it was broken by the 2008 financial crash. As much as the global financial crash of 2008 made a villain of the financial sector, it is worth noting that the total cash injection by the UK government was around $137 billion in total, much of which has been recouped. As of 2018, the direct cost of the bailout has been reduced to $35 billion and only represents 3 to 5% of the overall debt rise between 2008 and 2012. The big problem the recession caused the government was the reduction in tax revenues at the same time government spending massively increased. Gordon Brown had not, in fact, abolished boom and bust, and suddenly found himself with a lot of unfunded government liabilities when the golden goose of the city stopped laying eggs. It was not the bank bailout, but the deficit between government revenue and expenditure, along with the COVID response, that has led to our current eye-watering debt-to-GDP ratio. Another current favourite of the left is to share images of LED-lit skyscrapers from China as proof that communism works, but fail to attribute China's recent economic growth to the profound economic transformation China underwent following the rise of Deng Xiaoping, shifting away from the centrally planned Soviet-style economy with state-owned enterprises and collectivized agriculture. First, the household responsibility system allowed farmers to sell their excess grain on the open market, boosting productivity, rural incomes, and freeing up labour for industry. This is a direct reversal of the policies of Stalin or Mao that we might consider communist or Marxist. Deng was creating kulaks, not killing them. Deng then established special economic zones that were open to foreign direct investment, i.e. foreign ownership of the means of production, not mass ownership of the means of production, i.e. not communism. Reforms continued in the 1990s under Jiang Zemin, with the mass privatization of state-owned enterprises, sound familiar? But maintaining party control of strategic sectors. State price controls were relaxed, and in 1991, the Shanghai stock market was established. Or should I say, re-established, as it had originally been founded in 1891 before being shut down after Mao's victory in 1949, as communists tend to not like stock markets as they see them as tools of capitalist oppression. Capitalist economies all have stock markets. Communist countries don't. To put things in perspective, at the time of the 1997 handover, Hong Kong had a GDP per capita of $27,000 compared to $800 on the mainland. China does not provide evidence of the success of communist economic policies because it only became rich after it had abandoned them. This is not to say modern China represents laissez-faire capitalism. It does not. The previous economy that most closely resembles that of modern China was, in fact, Nazi Germany. Like Nazi Germany, China has a mixed economy under one-party control. Private ownership and market mechanisms are maintained, but with state-directed production in strategic industries to keep them in alignment with national goals. Their prioritization of heavy industry, infrastructure, and military rearmament is also similar, as are their aims of strategic resource self-sufficiency. With private enterprise dominating around 60% of China's GDP, the only similarities between modern China and the USSR is that they are one-party states, and we stand on the precipice of a world dominated by Han Chinese fascism. There is nothing about modern China that vindicates the economic theories of Karl Marx. But what has been the point of this video? Economic questions that took a back foot during the 2015 to 2025 culture war era are becoming prominent in the discourse once again. Any movement that is serious about taking power must have some agreement over its economic policy, and disagreements are beginning to dissolve previous alliances from the past decade. Personally, I would not see the period of privatization as either an abject failure or a runaway success. It has created a system where the government's role is market regulator rather than a direct provider of a service, meaning that by 1991, the privatized industries contributed nearly $8 billion to the public coffers, having previously been subsidized to the tune of $2 billion, representing an $11 billion turnaround. There have been failures like Thames Water, and there is a much stronger case for the nationalisation of industries like the railways. But the low calibre of our current crop of politicians means that giving them direct control of vital industries could easily make the situation even worse. I don't want Angela Rayner to be in charge of the national grid. The unaffordability of housing is another major economic issue, one that is particularly pertinent for Zoomers, and their experiences may influence their political outlook, increasing their support for left-wing economic policy. It is not a good thing that so many people are priced out of the market, but when net immigration exceeds the number of new houses built each year for 20 years, there is going to be pressure on housing, whatever your financial system. The current Labour government are reportedly already way behind on their house building goals. Offshoring your industry might have been a reasonable policy in Fukuyama's world, but it is starting to seem like a reckless one in the clash of civilizations world that has in fact emerged from the end of the Cold War. But it seems to me that if our nationalized industries failed during the Cold War era, we would have even less of a chance of making it work in today's globalized economy. Currently, the only British-owned manufacturing companies that employ over 10,000 people in the UK are BAE, Rolls-Royce, AstraZeneca and GSK. Any potential left-wing government is likely to pursue policies that would destroy these companies, i.e. reductions in defence spending, etc. There is barely anything left to nationalise other than utilities, and we are not about to build this stuff from the ground up. The neoliberal reforms of the 80s might have gutted what remained of British industry, but it was already dying and perhaps beyond help by the time Thatcher had arrived in office. Once the car industry is gone, as the major post-war industry until the internet era, it becomes much harder to compete with the heavy industry of countries that do have successful car industries. The other option would have been going down the protectionist route championed by the likes of Tony Benn, which would have led to a siege economy that would have made no sense in a globalizing world. Britain's initial advantages in industrialization and empire are now long gone, and we can either find a way to pay for ourselves in the modern world or slide into poverty. As Curtis Yarvin remarked on his recent visit, "I see a lot of wealth, but I don't see a lot of productivity. The real estate is out of this world, though." Any attempt to bring serious manufacturing back to the UK would have to begin with the reversal of net zero and a reduction in electricity prices for industry. The base electric cost of producing a tonne of aluminium is $3,080 in the UK, compared to either $1,260 in China and $1,162 in the USA. Any UK aluminium plant would have to run the rest of its operations around 60% more efficient than the Chinese or American plant just to make its aluminium at the same price due to this massive difference in input cost. No wonder there is so little manufacturing in the UK. It looks like the next few elections are going to be dominated by Reform and the Green Party, neither of whom I have a great deal of confidence in. Neither seem to have any plan to deal with the other contributing factor to Britain's economic malaise, the sad case of Nicholas, 30 years old, who represents the 28 million private sector workers who must carry 6 million public sector workers, nearly 2 million unemployed, and the over 20 million economically inactive citizens, in the form of pensioners and the roughly 20% of the working age population who are economically inactive for whatever reason. As it has the ability to issue money through the Bank of England, the UK government can never go bankrupt, unlike the Euro-states, as Greece found out to their cost. But endless printing erodes the value of the pound, and government interest payments have risen to over £100 billion a year, or around 9 to 10% of total tax revenue. To put that in perspective, HS2 was estimated to cost less than £100 billion before it was scrapped.
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature, Mr. Beale, and I won't have it. Is that clear? You think you merely stopped a business deal? That is not the case. The Arabs have taken billions of dollars out of this country, and now they must put it back. It is ebb and flow, tidal gravity. It is ecological balance. You are an old man who thinks in terms of nations and peoples. There are no nations. There are no peoples. There are no Russians. There are no Arabs. There are no third worlds. There is no West. There is only one holistic system of systems. One vast and immane, interwoven, interacting, multivariate, multinational dominion of dollars. Petrodollars, electrodollars, multi-dollars, Reichmarks, rims, rubles, pounds, and shekels. It is the international system of currency which determines the totality of life on this planet. That is the natural order of things today. That is the atomic and subatomic and galactic structure of things today. And you have meddled with the primal forces of nature. And you will atone. Am I getting through to you, Mr. Beale? You get up on your little 21-inch screen and howl about America and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. Those are the nations of the world today. What do you think the Russians talk about in their councils of state? Karl Marx? They get out their linear programming charts, statistical decision theories, Minimax solutions, and compute the price-cost probabilities of their transactions and investments, just like we do. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies, Mr. Beale. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime. And our children will live, Mr. Beale, to see that perfect world in which there's no war or famine, oppression or brutality. One vast and ecumenical holding company for whom all men will work to serve a common profit, in which all men will hold a share of stock, all necessities provided, all anxieties tranquilized, all boredom amused. And I have chosen you, Mr. Beale, to preach this evangel.
Why me?
Because you're on television, dummy. 60 million people watch you every night of the week, Monday through Friday.
I have seen the face of God.
You just might be right, Mr. Beale.
However true that was in the 70s, it is truer now. It seems we are entering a high-tech, low-life, cyberpunk world, with no escape from managerial oversight, whether it be in the form of a government or a corporation. Digital ID will become the basis of our own version of the Chinese social credit system, and as China rises and the West loses global hegemony, it is likely the UK will slide further into relative poverty in the 21st century. If you have a football team where all the players are fat and rubbish, changing the formation probably won't make much difference. Even as I lose hope that the situation for Western civilization will improve much in terms of the big picture, This is still a battle to be fought for as long as it can. However, it is starting to look like localism and parallelism are our best options for achieving something.